Hey everybody, thanks for coming. Appreciate you being here on a Friday. Evidently it's the last day of school for the teachers and kids, so there's a party going on right there. But I'm really thankful for you to come out. My name is Tim Ryan. I'm running for president. I'm a congressman from Northeast Ohio. My district, I represent Youngstown, Ohio, which is about halfway between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. I also have Akron. I also have Kent State, the famous Kent State University. Like I said, I'm about an hour from Cleveland, about an hour from Pittsburgh, where my wife lives, and I live, and our kids live. My wife is a first grade school teacher. Mason is 16 years old. He just started driving in November. I love it and hate it all at the same time, as you know. Bella is 15. Mason plays football and track. Bella is a cheerleader and does some gymnastics. Brady, our youngest, will be 5 on June 12th. And he reminds me of that every time I talk to him. Daddy, you know my birthday's coming up. And so they're back at home. And I'm running for president because I've represented a district that for about 40 years, like a lot of the country, has seen huge economic collapse. I'm really at the epicenter of the deindustrialization of the United States. We saw steel mills close when my father-in-law worked there. We saw where he lost his job for over a year, right after my wife was born. 20 years ago, my cousin Donnie worked at a factory that supplied General Motors with the wiring harnesses. He called me one day after work saying that towards his last day or two of work, he actually had to unbolt the machine from the factory floor, put it in a box, and ship it to China. That was one of his last acts. And then just recently, in the last few months, we saw the General Motors factory that had about 3,000 people working there 2 years ago. Went from 3 shifts to 2 shifts to 1 shift, and now to no shifts. We lost, over the course of the last couple of decades, 16,000 jobs were in that facility. So I'm running for the presidency because we need a policy in the United States that focuses on growing the economy for working class people. And I know, if you look at a lot of the Democrats, a lot of us have very similar positions on issues that really matter to a lot of us, on climate change. We all have positions. Healthcare is a right. We have positions on that we all pretty much agree on. Criminal justice reform, I think we all agree we need it. Gun control, I think we all agree that we need it. But if we're going to beat Donald Trump, if we're going to take him down, we have got to campaign on us being the party that can build the economy again for the middle class. The bottom 60% in this country haven't seen a raise since 1980. And I don't care how much the president says that unemployment's low and the stock market's up. He can say it all he wants. But people where I come from don't have money in the stock market necessarily. They don't necessarily even have a savings. And we've seen the erosion of investments in our schools, in our health, in our communities. We have a mental health crisis in the United States. We have a meth crisis in Iowa. We've got an opiate epidemic in Ohio. We see our teen suicide rates are up. We see adverse childhood experiences for kids are up, traumatizing our kids, living in poverty. And I'm not going to stand by and let one more generation go by where we've not addressed the most critical issue in the country, which I believe is rebuilding the middle class. That, to me, is the main issue. And if we're going to beat Trump in Western PA, if we're going to beat him in Ohio, if we're going to beat him in Michigan, if we're going to beat him in Wisconsin, if we're going to beat him in Iowa, the conversation has to be he has failed to have a policy to rebuild the middle class because he has not had one. You can't cut taxes for the top 1% of the people in the United States, the wealthiest people in the country, and provide mental health coverage. Cutting taxes does not build hospitals, it doesn't pay teachers, it doesn't build roads, it doesn't help us with research and development. It doesn't help us win the future. I'm just going to talk for a little bit, just a few minutes, about the economy right now, where I think we need to go, and then I'm happy to open it up for questions. When those factories closed, when those steel mills closed in Youngstown in the late 1970s, the technology in the steel mills, was pre-World War I. Pre-World War I in the 1970s. And we got wiped out because other countries were investing into the future. They were grabbing the latest technology and they were running with it. And we are at the same point today. We hear stories about driverless cars. We hear stories about machine learning. We hear stories about artificial intelligence. And I believe we're at the same inflection point we were back then. We have a decision to make. Either we are going to embrace the technology and we're going to lead the world in it, or we're going to get left behind. And that's coming from someone who's scared to death about what the future looks like for our kids. It's a 16-year-old, 15-year-old, and Brady will be 5. I'm scared. I'm scared, but I do know one thing, that if the United States decides we're going to lead the world in certain technologies, certain sectors of the economy, we will win that. And so I want to just give you a couple of examples that we mentioned a little bit earlier. In the next 10 years, there's going to be 30 million electric vehicles built in this world, somewhere. The American worker needs to make those cars. The American worker needs to build the batteries that goes into those cars. The American worker needs to develop and build the electric charging stations that are going to charge those cars. You know who controls the electric vehicle market today? China. They control 40 to 50% of the electric vehicle market. I want to do the same thing with solar panels. Who controls the solar industry today? China, 60%. These are good paying jobs. I don't want us to keep talking about the minimum wage. I'm for the fight for 15. You're probably all for the fight for 15, all right? But we cannot be the party that talks about $15 an hour. We've got to be the party that talks about $30, $40, $50 an hour. Good, solid, middle class, mid-wage jobs for American people who work hard and play by the rules. So I was just at a company. You say, how are you going to get $50 an hour jobs? I was just at a company not too far from here, and the men and women putting the solar panels on the businesses make $50 an hour. They're IBEW union workers. This is doable in the United States if you have a president who is going to sit down in public-private partnerships and say, we're going to dominate this industry. And then we're going to sit down with all of the players and all of the partners and stakeholders around solar, around wind, around artificial intelligence, and we're going to say, how do we dominate this industry with public-private partnerships? We're going to stop fighting with each other, and we're going to figure out how we put this thing together. And I will tell you, I grew up watching this deindustrialization happen. I grew up watching my friends leave my community. I grew up watching families suffer. We started to see the opiate epidemic, hopelessness, despair. I'm not going to take it anymore. So I'm running for president because I know what needs to be done in this economy, because I've been watching what's happened the last 45 years of my life, in the last 20 years of my life in Congress and in the state Senate in Ohio. I know what needs to be done, and it starts with leadership. I'll leave you with one last thing. When I get up in the morning and I walk into the Oval Office, no one's going to have to explain to me who I'm there for. I'm not going to have an aide whisper in my ear and say, Mr. President, remember when you're talking about things, remember those people in Ohio who are hurting. Remember those people in Iowa who had the factories closed. Remember the people in Gary, Indiana who lost those steel jobs. I'm going to know why I'm there. And I will promise you that I will pull every lever that I could pull. I will use every ounce of power that I have to help the working class rebuild. We've been waiting for 40 years, and it's time for us to come together. Rural, urban, black, white, brown, gay, straight, come together as a country and say this system is not working for us. It's time for us to rebuild. I need your help. I need your support. I know you're from Iowa, which means you have commitment issues when it comes to presidential candidates. I realize that you need to meet me another 33 times before we can come to an agreement. but I will continue to talk to you and listen to you and express to you why I feel deeply in my heart that I'm the person to do this. I'm about as grounded as a person you can have. My family is grounded. As I say, you know where I live, you know where we come from. My wife's a school teacher. This is what we do. When these factories close, those are my friends. When President Trump tweeted about the union leader in Lordstown from the UAW, that's a guy I drink beer with, right? That's my friend. Dave Green is my friend. And so no one's going to have to explain to me what we're doing or why we're doing it. And so I would love to have your help. I would love to have your support. We're building something that is going to be worker-centered, and it's going to be based on how we get this economy rebuilt. Thank you for being here. I know you have a lot of different places you could be. I'm happy to talk to you about any questions that you may have over the course of the next few minutes. Thank you so much. Okay, 1 second. Go ahead.
I wonder if you would consider not giving some of the $3.8 billion that we send to Israel every year in order to make sure that they are willing to give equal rights to Palestinians.
I think the United States has got to be an honest broker within the peace process. And that, to me, is critical to us achieving peace in the Middle East. And as president, I will be an honest broker. We obviously have a special relationship, military, culturally, and otherwise, with Israel. But I'll tell you a story about a Palestinian friend of mine from Youngstown who got deported, who I literally went to the ICE facility with him and his wife. And they pulled him right out from our very eyes and put him in prison and sent him back to Jordan. I have a very close relationship with a lot of people in the Palestinian community, especially Amr and his family, and you can bet I'm going to be an honest broker in that process. Yes, sir.
Question I have for you, Congressman, is a lot of fellow candidates have talked about trying to fight corruption, probably at the federal level or state level. Something I've always considered is that if you're elected president, you can only serve 2 terms and then you're done. You do what for your life. But as a U.S. Houseman or U.S. Senator, you can serve as long as you want, possibly even beat Strom Thurmond's record. So I wanted to know what you had planned on possibly fighting corruption, and if you feel that U.S. Senators and House Representatives should be limited on terms they serve.
So the issues. Yeah. So the question is around term limits and whether, as a 17-year congressman, if I believe in term limits. You won't be surprised with my answer. But the issue really was around corruption, and I think that's a good question. I do not personally believe in term limits because what happens is when you get to Congress, it's obviously a lot of very complicated subjects, a lot of complicated matters with a lot of ins and a lot of outs and a lot of what have yous. And I believe that members of Congress gaining that experience with how the bureaucracy works is really, really important, because if you don't have an experienced member of Congress, the bureaucrats, and I don't say that in a negative way, but people who are running the government will know way more than the elected members of Congress. And they will manipulate the system to the point where you won't be able to get anything done. So, it takes you several terms to really understand these issues. Now, to the corruption question, I believe that we should publicly finance elections in the United States and get the money out of politics. I think if you want to get rid of corruption, that's the way to do it. Get this money out of politics, where it seems like it's the only indicator these days of worth of any candidates or anything. How much money? How much money? How much money? It's not about the money. It's about the people. And so let's do what they do in Europe. Carve out a couple of months before an election. Give everybody a little bit of money. Open up the airwaves. Do what we're doing right here, right now. And to me, that's the way you run the elections and reduce corruption. Yeah.
I want to know whether you want to do with mental health resources, especially with the youth. Just earlier this week at Southeast Junior High, a 12-year-old girl committed suicide.
Oh my God.
I don't know the specific reason, but that in itself is a massive issue, in my opinion, that we're having teen suicide rise around the nation. And I was curious if you had any plans related to mental health.
Yeah, the questions about mental health, especially with regard to young people. And we've seen most recently in the last few years an increase in teen suicides. We've seen an increase in farmers taking their own lives. And mental health is an issue across the country. And I know it's an issue here in Iowa. I believe it starts with making sure that everybody has access to affordable, accessible health care, and that health care package, like any kind of public option, which I supported during the Affordable Care Act and support now, is making sure that we have some kind of public option for people to buy into, that basic coverage includes mental health coverage. When I was in Northwest Iowa last week, the big issue was around reimbursements. And the reimbursement is not high enough to actually draw providers into some of the rural areas. So that's a big question. And then I think we've got to start playing offense. So one of the themes you'll see over the next couple of, I'm not drinking beer, so I'm not loud enough. We can change that though. I mean, I can tell you. One of the ways to play offense with mental health, and we were just talking about this in a school up in Waterloo around social and emotional learning and mental health promotion in the schools, which is critically important to start to teach kids how to become more resilient, how to deal with their own trauma, how to deal with their own adverse childhood experiences, and that will help them making sure we get therapists in our schools. We were talking to a woman who does play therapy with a lot of the kids in the schools. There's no reason in the United States why we shouldn't have those kind of mental health programs in our schools, in every school in the United States. And I think we should make a commitment to do that. My commitment is to make sure social and emotional learning is in all the schools. I think we also got to look at what's happening with technology today and what technology's effect is on our brains, especially the brain of a young person. I think that's critically important. And one of the signature issues we'll be pushing is I want to create a National Institute for Nutrition to actually study and understand the effects of food and the effects that food is having on our own health and including our mental health. Yes, sir. Go ahead, my man. Go ahead.
Tim Keller. There is a statement.
I need you to give me a 30-second question, okay?
What are we going to do about the Viet Cong of Grays when it relocates by the stadium to make this emergency worse with Peter Harmon's internment camps where he places mentally challenged disabled people as if he didn't want them to live in society and all the rest? I'm a witness to all of that.
Okay, I'm gonna check that out. Can I talk to you right after this?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yes.
Could you talk to us about education at all levels?
Yeah.
Preschool, elementary, secondary, and then university, kind of your views about all
Sure.
that, including student debt.
Sure. Okay, gotcha. So the question's about education and student debt, but K through 12 all the way through. We'll work our way backwards. So starting with people who've graduated and have the student debt now, I think it's important for us, and my wife went on to get her master's degree, so we're still paying her student loans off. I think it's important for us to give those people an opportunity to renegotiate down the high interest rates that they have that are 6, 7, 8% depending on the loan, and negotiate that down to a couple of percent, which will put more money in their pockets, or give them the opportunity to pay down the principal on the loan. I am on the bills in Congress for free college, debt-free college. I think the first step we need to take going down that road is to make sure we do something along the lines of K through 14. I just think today the jobs that are of the future around electric vehicles and solar and wind and artificial intelligence and machine learning and all of these things, you're going to need at least 1 or 2 years of post-secondary education. And so I think there should be no economic barriers to people doing that. It'll be good for the economy, and I think we should start moving in that direction to get us to K through 13, K through 14. K through 12, I've got 3 main issues we're working on. One is the social and emotional learning that I mentioned. Social and emotional learning is a program that basically says we want to make sure we're dealing with the kids' hearts first and their minds and any trauma that they may be coming to the school with. Be amazed at the amount of trauma some of our kids come to our schools with. We know that over 50% of kids who go to our public schools are low income. They're low income kids. And when you look at the adverse childhood experiences that happen when kids are low income, they're multiple. Social and emotional learning helps these kids deal with it. It helps them learn self-regulation so they can learn how to regulate their emotions. It helps connect them to other kids in the school. It helps connect them to their teacher. We bring the parents in some of these programs in and actually teach the parents some of these social and emotional learning techniques. Now here's the money line. If you have a robust social and emotional learning program in your school, in the United States today, they did a study of about 300,000 kids, 11 percentile point increase in test scores, completely closes the achievement gap, 10% increase in good behavior, 10% decrease in antisocial behavior, 20% swing in the mood of the school, okay, and closes the achievement gap. Why? Because we know as a species that we learn through connection. And we know that if a child's brain is in fight or flight mode, they literally can't access the part of their brain they need to learn, their executive functions, in their prefrontal cortex, their working memory, their ability to focus and concentrate, their decision making, all done in a part of the brain that doesn't really function very well when you're in fight or flight mode. So social and emotional learning programs helps get these kids out of fight or flight mode, and wouldn't you know, the test scores come online. So social and emotional learning in our schools. I want healthy food in our schools as well. We can't just talk about quantity of calories that we're giving our kids, it's got to be quality. We've got a high diabetes, type 2 diabetes issue with our kids, and that's going to kill our healthcare system. So social and emotional learning, healthy food, and then a robust vocational training program that could literally get kids on a track while they're still in high school for a potential 1 or 2 year degree, but they're already getting on that track for some kind of job that doesn't necessarily require college. Got time for 1 or 2 more. I'm getting thirsty.
I'm an old guy.
I didn't notice.
I'm an old guy, so I worry about debt.
Yeah.
I know these new programs are neat.
Yeah.
I know that by the time you get to my age, if you've got a lot of debt, it's gonna hurt.
Yeah.
Is there any, does anybody talk about a program to pay off and reduce the public debt?
The public debt. Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge issue. We've got about a $22 trillion, this is a question around public debt. We've got about a $22 trillion debt, and starting, I think, in the next year or two, we're going to be running about $1 trillion a year deficits, annual deficits. And the tax cut that the Republicans just passed blew a huge hole in what we had going on. 2.3 trillion just in what we're going to have to borrow and pay back in the tax cut. So I think we need to do a couple of things. As Democrats, we have got to get the government running more efficiently. I think it's wrong for us as a party to ignore the technology and the capabilities of making government run more efficiently. I'll give you a quick example. The New York subway project, I think it's the 2nd Street subway project, costs $1.7 billion per kilometer. Okay, $1.7 billion per kilometer. Same project, similar project, in Berlin, in Copenhagen costs $250 million per kilometer because of the bureaucracy and the permitting and all of the different things that we do. We've got to audit the Defense Department. There's a lot of waste. Elizabeth Warren, myself, Congressman Ro Khanna, we just busted a company actually in Ohio that was scamming money from the Defense Department. We need to do a complete audit of the Defense Department. So squeeze government. I'm not saying we don't continue to support the initiatives we support. I'm saying we still should be for the government running efficiently. And then we have to ask, at this point, the wealthiest people, the taxes of people who make $50 million a year or more, that raise the top bracket, reinstate the estate tax, and move our taxation system from being so concentrated on labor to being more focused on capital gains. Because that's where a lot of the money is. And to have a lower rate than somebody who's working for a living, to me, doesn't seem fair. That'll generate a lot of money. And I think we could put a lot of that on the deficit, and we could also have a lot of money to reinvest back into our country. But we've got to have a strategy, too, to grow the economy, which will help us pay down the debt. Bill Clinton did this. Like, we did this. We had the surpluses coming. And then George Bush came in and passed 2 rounds of tax cuts, and we blew all the money that could have went to pay the debt down. We could have put it in. You remember Al Gore kept talking about a lockbox? He said, I'm going to take the surplus money, I'm going to put it in a lockbox. And Saturday Night Live kept making fun of him. But he was going to take the surplus money and put it in Social Security and Medicare and extend the life of the program. And Bush came in and gave it back to everybody in a tax cut. Our people got $300, maybe $600 to a couple, and now where are we at? Right? This trickle-down economics has not worked. We got to get back to kind of the investment. So it's a long-term strategy for us. One more question. Last one.
We have been fighting wars, and it's costing us about $32 million an hour to fight in the Middle East, while China has been building the last 3 decades.
Yeah.
They lifted about 700 million people out of poverty, and they are a competitor economically now.
Yeah.
And we've been ruining Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and also Syria, and elsewhere. What's your policy on foreign policy and how to compete with China?
Yeah, a great question. How do you compete with China? And I agree. I mean, you can go back. My first campaign, who's talking about wars, we're spending money on war, and China's spending money on building their economy out, and that's why they're winning now. I mean, I don't know if you were here, but they control 40% of the electric vehicle market, 60% of the solar panel market. China's running circles around us in 5th generation internet. Huawei is, moving and shaking, and we're falling behind. So when I first ran, one of the first commercials my opponent ran against me, my first time for Congress, was that I was against the war in Iraq when it was just happening. So I took a stand against the war before it was popular. And so I'm proud of that, but that's where my mindset is. We do not need to be getting into any more wars. We got to have a strong presence in the world. Don't get me wrong, but this war has cost us a generation. How do you beat China? You outcompete them. You have an industrial policy in the United States where you pick these industries. So China has a program called China 2025, in which they want to be the #1 country in the top 10 technologies and the top 10 industries in the world, right? Artificial intelligence, aerospace, biotech, wind, solar, like right down the line. And they have a long-term plan that they're administering now that is 2025, but they got a 10-year plan, they got a 20-year plan, they got a 40-year plan, they got a 50-year plan, they got a 100-year plan. We have a 24-hour news cycle in the United States. That's why we're losing, and that's why the president can no longer be the president, and why we need somebody who's going to put an industrial policy together. That's why I'm running. You got to put an industrial policy together, driven by the White House, driven by the President of the United States, saying, okay, here's the electric vehicle market. And sit down with the big 3 auto companies, the emerging electric vehicle companies, the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Defense, venture capital, private sector, and you sit there and you say, okay, how do we dominate this market? And my Secretary of Energy is going to drive this thing, and I'm going to be president, and I'm going to drive it. And then the next week you have a meeting around solar. And you say, bring in the solar companies, Department of Energy and people who are involved in this, bring the unions in. I want the workers cut in on all these deals so that we have a middle class again in the United States. And we do the same thing with solar. How do we dominate the solar market? Then the next week we do it with wind. And say, how do we do it with wind? How do we dominate these markets? And my job as president is going to be driving this agenda to happen. That's how you beat China. You leapfrog them, because once you put our venture capital community, once you put our innovators, our private sector people behind ideas, and I think you do this around climate, where you align financial incentives with environmental incentives. So you want to reverse climate change, you get people to start making a little bit of money off of the technologies that are going to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Or you start paying farmers to do regenerative agriculture so they can sequester carbon in the soil, which will also help with flooding and everything else, and environmental issues everywhere else. You outcompete them. But it starts with the president putting his Twitter down and focusing on an industrial policy in the United States. I just told you what I'm going to do.
No, the Democrats. What did they do already? I mean, in Congress.
Well, I mean, President Obama did a couple of things. I mean, in Congress right now, we just passed but we just got in. This is our first budget. We just put millions of dollars into, for example, the Advanced Technology Vehicle Program, which is a government loan program for companies who want to convert from old line cars or old line technologies into factories, new line. So Tesla has used this program to move forward. The president zeroed it out. We put money back in there. I think we've got to expand, and we kept the tax credits for electric vehicles. The president wanted to get rid of those, and we've got to double down on research and development around renewable energy. Wind, solar, electric vehicles, all of these incentives. We've got to use every lever we got to do it. So that's what we've done in this budget in particular. All right, I lost my voice. I'm done. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it.